Hello, and welcome to the Foundation of Faith series, The Bridge Builder's Code, Volume 1, by Jenny Jo Bingham. Today we will be reading Chapter 13, A Table for the Broken. The lodge still smelled faintly of cedar and long-forgotten potlucks. Jake had spent the morning clearing dust from the old dining hall, pushing tables together, setting mismatched chairs around them, dragging up folding benches from the basement storage. Grace brought tablecloths. Jenny brought some leftovers and paper plates. Elena and Noah Reyes strung twinkle lights across the rafters like they were decorating for a high school dance. It wasn't fancy, but it was something. A table prepared for a group of people still figuring out if they could sit beside one another. Jake stood at the end of the long table, hands on the back of a chair, watching as they trickled in one by one. Marcus arrived first, toolbox still in his truck like a buffer. He nodded without words, placed a bottle of sweet tea on the table, and took a seat at the far left. Clara Whitmore stepped inside cautiously, arms crossed, expression unreadable, but she sat. That was enough. Jake hadn't expected to see her. They hadn't really talked since he came back. Just a few polite nods at the cafe, away from her porch once. But Grace had mentioned she'd invited a few people who'd helped on town committees in the past, people who knew how to hold things together when everything else fell apart. Clara fit that description more than most. Life had stripped more from her than anyone should have to bear. Her brother gone too soon, her father walking out when she was barely old enough to understand, and a mother who carried her grief like an anchor until Clara learned to shoulder most of the weight herself. She didn't complain. She adapted. She learned how to keep the lights on, how to stretch a mill, how to show up for people even when no one showed up for her. That made her steady now. Careful. Resilient in ways that didn't always show, but were felt the moment she entered a room. So when she found a seat near the end of the table, not beside Jake, but not across the room either, it meant something, even if she didn't say it out loud. Evan came last. Not because he was unsure, but because he wasn't the type to make an entrance. He lingered in the doorway for a moment, jeans worn, expression unreadable, taking in the sight of old friends gathered around a table that hadn't seen this much laughter in years. Jake caught his eye across the room and gave a small nod, equal parts welcome and understanding. They'd already done the hard work of honesty, apology, and muddy mornings with hammers in hand. But this was different. This was breaking bread, and that required a different kind of courage. Evan stepped inside without a word, pulling up a chair that had been left open. Not a grand gesture, just a quiet return. Jake slid a plate toward him. Evan took it with a nod and a smirk. Told you I'd show up. Jake grinned. Took you long enough. The others carried on with their stories, but Jake noticed the shift. Something had hit a little deeper just then. Not loud or dramatic, but true. Grace lit the candles at the center of the table. They flickered against the darkening windows and made the place feel warmer than it was. Jake cleared his throat. He scratched the back of his neck. I didn't plan a speech. A few chuckles. Even Marcus smirked. I just thought we've all been carrying different parts of this thing, and maybe we needed to stop for a minute. Not to work, not to argue, not to fix, but to just be in the same room, to eat, to laugh, maybe. Or not. Either way, the table's here. Silence settled in for a beat. Then Miss Dunn piped up from the side table. Well, if no one else is going to start praying, I will. They all bowed their head, except Evan, who kept his eyes open, staring forward into the firelight. Jake noticed, but didn't call it out. Evan wasn't being disrespectful. He just had a different way of listening, the kind that didn't always close its eyes, the kind still waiting for answers, but unwilling to stop asking. Jake understood that look. He'd worn it himself not long ago. The meal unfolded slowly, unevenly. Conversation bumped along like a wagon on a rocky road. Micah asked Marcus about car engines. Elena argued with Clara about which bridge design was more efficient. Walt tried to explain concrete ratios and ended up stuck in a story about accidentally cementing his boot to a loading dock in 1979. And somewhere in the middle of it, amid laughter and folks scraping plates, Jake caught Evan watching him. Not with suspicion, just that quiet, assessing look he always had when he was building something and wanted to make sure it was level. Jake gave the smallest of nods and slid the breadbasket his way. Evan accepted it with a half smile and a grunt that, from him, counted as a thank you. Nothing grand, just the kind of ease that comes from showing up, side by side, day after day, until trust stops needing to be rebuilt. After dessert, 3 kinds of cobbler, and Grace's regrettable attempt at gluten-free brownies, Jake stood again, this time holding his father's journal. He didn't open it. He just looked around the room and said, "I found something a few days ago, a letter from my dad. He wrote about legacy, about not finishing something for the sake of success, but finishing it because obedience matters." His voice cracked. No one interrupted. "I think he meant this bridge, but I also think he meant this. Us. Community. People who don't always fit, don't always agree, don't always get it right, but still show up." He paused. "That's what I'm trying to build," Jake said. "With you, if you're still in." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was sacred, settled, like 2 beams locking into place with no splinters between them. Evan ran a thumb along the edge of his plate, then gave Jake a look, half smirk, half approval. "You finally saying this thing's gonna hold?" Jake nodded without pause. "I think it already is." Evan leaned back in his chair and reached for another roll. "Took you long enough to catch up." Jake chuckled. "Eat something before you start quoting the journal, too." That broke the last of the tension. Grace laughed softly from across the room, and conversation picked up around the table like embers catching fire. The bridge might have been outside, but the real rebuilding was happening right here. Grace leaned against the kitchen doorway, arms crossed loosely, watching the group settle into laughter and conversation. Jake now stood beside her, drying his hands with a towel. "I didn't think they'd come," Jake admitted quietly. Grace smiled, a little tired but warm. "People want to believe in something again. They just needed someone stubborn enough to go first." He glanced sideways at her. "You're not exactly short on stubborn yourself." "I learned from the best," she teased, then softer. "You've changed, Jake." Jake leaned on the counter, thoughtful. "Sometimes I'm not sure if I've changed or just finally stopped pretending." Grace nodded slowly. "Either way, you're showing up now, and people notice that. I notice that." He turned to face her more fully, the weight of everything they hadn't said hanging just between them. "I wasn't really ready before," he said. "To stay, to build, to face what I left behind, including you." Grace held his gaze for a beat. "I know, but I'm not here for apologies tonight. I'm here for what's ahead." Jake exhaled, something like relief, something like awe. "So, you think there's something ahead?" She smiled, eyes bright. "There's a bridge outside that says we're already halfway there." They stood for a moment in quiet agreement, the noise of the table fading into the background. Not everything had to be resolved in that instant, but the road forward had widened. That is the end of chapter 13. Thank you for joining us, and we hope you continue to follow along with us. Have a great day.